Welcome to our KSP journey. I'm starting off a complete newbie, having just completed the default tutorials to Orbit. I have downloaded a few mods and my eventual aim is to create a fully reusable orbital launch vehicle. But for now this is Tomhopper, a basic low altitude testbed. Let's go fly. Our first test is unspectacular. We placed the engine ignition stage after the separation stage. Our dream of a 100% reusable orbital vehicle is quite far away. For our next attempt, the staging is in the correct order, but our launch looks more like a static fire. We just don't have enough thrust to launch. We've added 2 more liquid-fueled engines to get us away from the pad. One day, with a bigger fuel tank, this might even get us to orbit. Our first low altitude test is about to begin. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We ejected the capsule to save the crew, and chute deployed. That's the sound of the first stage exploding. The issue here is that we didn't activate stability assist. Ultimately, we recovered the crew and we'll try again. This is our first low altitude test with stability assist on. The objectives are a successful launch, separation and recovery of the capsule. The first stage is disposable on this early test. Main engine cutoff. The vehicle orients upside down after engine cutoff. We'll look at that later. Stage separation. With the objectives of launch and separation complete, let's hope we recover the capsule. Chutes deployed. A successful touchdown. It's on to our next flight test. We've now added grid fins. The objective of the next test is to land the entire craft under parachute on its legs. 3, 2, 1. It's a good launch. Main engine cut off as the fuel in the first stage expires. Vehicle goes upside down by default. We deployed the fins to try and fix it. It doesn't do a lot, so we retract them. We set stability assist to retrograde. The vehicle starts to right itself using the little aero parts it has. Future vehicles will have more aero surfaces and RCS. Deploy fins and legs for descent. Descent seems very stable. Chute deploy. It unfurls for landing. Descent rate looks good. Touchdown. Fins tuck back in and we go for the next test. This is our first propulsive landing test. It's like the last test, except we land the whole craft propulsively instead of using the chute. A propulsive landing uses only the engines to slow the vehicle down during descent. 3, 2, 1. Another successful liftoff. A manual engine cutoff instead of when the fuel expires because we need some fuel for our descent. Once again, the craft backflips to correct the upside down orientation. Deploy the legs. and fins for landing. Testing the engine relight. A few more test fires to gauge the effect on descent rate. Using propulsion here to decrease descent rate. And the descent rate looks good. First stage fuel expired. Eject the capsule to save the crew. The first stage lands hard. And the capsule lands softly on top of the destroyed first stage. Let's see how the next attempt goes. Something goes wrong with the backflip and the vehicle never has a stable upright attitude. Lighting the engine doesn't correct it. So we detach the capsule and deploy the chute. The first stage lands hard again. We recover the capsule and try again. On the next attempt we make it to the landing burn again. Keeping the descent rate low. Odd stability assist behaviour. The next burn overcorrects and the fuel expires. Despite staging the capsule and deploying the chute, the height is too low and it burns up with the first stage. On our next attempt, we throttle the engines. Engines cut as we start to hover. Some weird gimballing on reignition here. It becomes completely unstable. We pull the capsule free as the first stage explodes. A spectacular failure, but the crew is safe. Let's try again. We've learned from our mistakes, and after a good launch, we're hoping for a good descent and landing. I realised that on previous flights the craft was flipping upside down when fins were extended directly after engine cutoff. With no fins, the vehicle goes up and comes back down upright when momentum runs out. Fins and legs are extended when descent begins. We begin by throttling for a smoother descent. Descent rate is still a bit high as the ground approaches, so we go for a burst fire. If the bursts are too long, you bounce. With some short bursts, our first propulsive landing is complete. Let's move on to an orbital test flight. This is SNTom, our single stage to orbit craft building on Tomhopper with more fuel tanks and a flight computer. The objective of the first flight is to achieve orbit and deploy the capsule once in orbit. Liftoff looks good, engines are burning. Our initial orbital flights use a straight up trajectory, but on later flights we pitch downrange after launch. Main engine cutoff. During its coast phase, the vehicle pitches over. The first stage then relights and performs an insertion burn to achieve orbit. The vehicle has now successfully achieved orbit. Staging is successful and we deploy the payload. With test objective achieved, we leave both capsule and the first stage in orbit and prepare for the next test. SNTom 2 inserts a second stage between the first stage and the capsule. This will allow us to deorbit and recover the capsule for our next test. And we go for its first flight. Launch, engine cutoff and coast phase of the flight are normal. But we run out of fuel during our insertion burn due to the extra weight of the second stage. We separate the second stage all the same. We attempt a manual burn of the second stage to achieve orbit. But the burn is too long and we end up on an escape trajectory. With the vehicle lost, we test the capsule separation to confirm that works at least. With an extra fuel tank added to the first stage, we refly the SNTom 2 flight test. This is also the first flight with our new ascent trajectory and lower 80km orbit. Engine cutoff is normal, but the new trajectory heats the grid fins during ascent. After the coast phase, our insertion burn goes well. We achieve our first objective of getting the vehicle to orbit. Stage separation is normal and we deploy our second stage with capsule attached. For this test, the first stage stays in orbit and is not recovered. Our next objective is to use the second stage to deorbit the capsule. Once the deorbit burn is complete, we separate the capsule and dispose of the second stage. The capsule re-enters the atmosphere and successfully makes it out the other side. Our final test objective is to recover the capsule under parachute. Chute deploy. Chute expands. Splashdown, a successful test. The next vehicle version is called Tomship and adds a drone controller, battery and internal parachute to the first stage. We'll try to recover not only the capsule, but also the first stage under parachute. Launch is good. Ascent through atmosphere and engine cut-off is successful, but the grid fins still get a bit hot. Coast phase is good. And a good insertion burn. And successful stage separation. It's time to see if we can bring this booster home. Because we're landing under parachute, we can use all the fuel to deorbit. The booster has no RCS, so we weren't retrograde for re-entry. Things get pretty rough on the way down and we lose 3 grid fins. We make it through the atmosphere and the chute deploys. Although this is a water landing under chute, we test extending the legs. But the parachute fails to expand. Our first booster recovery attempt ends in failure. We don't try recovering the capsule on this attempt as we already know it works and we need to move on. Tomship 2 replaces the single internal chute with 4 external chutes and adds RCS. Our objectives here are the same as before, recover the capsule and first stage under parachute. We only need a very short deorbit ban. Re-entry is much better this time as we were properly retrograde. Grid fins and legs extended for landing. We also test fin retract and engine relight. With fins not deployed it's harder to stay upright, but the chutes deploy, unfurl and keep the vehicle straight. We touch down successfully, but the booster falls on uneven terrain and one of the legs is destroyed. The test overall is a success, as we can land the booster under chute, we just need to pick better terrain. To round off the test, the capsule also arrives home successfully under parachute. Having proved we can launch a vehicle to orbit and recover the first stage in capsule, it's time to move forward to true reusability. Building on our early propulsive landing test, our next step is to propulsively land not just the first stage, but also the second stage with capsule attached from orbit. We hope Tomship 3 will be a 100% reusable vehicle with its additional fuel tank plus grid fins and landing legs on its second stage. During ascent, the stage 2 grid fins are destroyed. Main engine cutoff. Good coast phase and insertion burn. Orbit successfully achieved. Staging is a disaster. The stage 2 legs were wrongly positioned and prevent separation from the first stage. Despite best efforts, we have to abandon the vehicle in orbit. We replace the stage 2 legs with smaller ones. Of course, the revised Tomship 3 also loses some grid fins during ascent, but we have other priorities. After a successful insertion burn, staging is an explosive disaster. With no way of recovering any part of the vehicle, we call it a day and head back to the lab again. We relocate Tomship 3's staging decoupler and cross our fingers. Before heading back to orbit, we decide to do some low altitude staging tests, and for the first time we'll attempt to propulsively land both stages. Engine cutoff and staging are triggered simultaneously at low altitude. Separation is successful. On stage separation, we deploy grid fins and landing legs on the first stage. We try to arrest the spin with some booster firings. It proves counterproductive. In later flights we'll use RCS, but for now the grid fins bring the booster back in line. We start throttling the booster to slow our rate of descent. And just like our small scale test, we use burst fires closer to the ground. although on its side, the booster is undamaged and reusable. Now let's try landing that second stage with capsule. We throttle, then light the second stage near the ground. It was a bad idea. Although the second stage landing was a failure as the vehicle is not reusable, at least the crew capsule survived. With the staging issue sorted and some propulsive landing practice in the books, we take Tom Ship 3 back to orbit. There go the fins. Orbit is achieved. Good separation. It's time to plan our deorbit burn for the first stage. The short first stage deorbit burn is carried out in map view. The first stage RCS is active to make sure it is retrograde when it hits the atmosphere. We lose a grid fin during re-entry. Leg deploy. Grid fin deploy. Our first propulsive landing attempt from orbit begins. Uncertainty over how to configure stability assist for landing led to an off-normal orientation. Now for the second stage attempt. With the landing burn performed in map view, the retrograde second stage with capsule begins re-entry. This is the first time we've attempted to recover a second stage, and those legs look pretty warm. At this point I'm unsure whether the explosive loss of our landing legs causes the instability or if the stage itself is unstable. Despite the vehicle's best attempts to right itself, we re-enter prograde and tear more parts off. The capsule survives and re-enters heat shield first, but there is no backup chute. Our first attempt to recover both stages from orbit propulsively ends in failure. We continued to make repeated low altitude and orbital test flights with various vehicle configurations as we work towards 100% reusability. Here's a montage of the results. Despite the continued failure of its first stage booster, Tomship 5 did give us a second stage that could land propulsively from orbit and be reused. Re-entry is still dynamic, but all the parts stay attached to the vehicle. As soon as the heat dies down, we can deploy the landing legs and fire the engine to reduce vertical speed. RCS set to retrograde corrects the attitude easily. Controlled thruster firings continue, giving a powered descent. Our first propulsive landing of a second stage with capsule is complete. Now to go back to work on the first stage. Once we can land that propulsively and recover it, we'll have a 100% reusable orbital rocket. To achieve that aim, we build Tomship 6, which is focused on first stage stability. This is the first deorbit and landing test of the new Tomship 6 first stage. As with the second stage, re-entry is rough, but the booster makes it through intact. Landing legs deployed. The vehicle struggles to get into the correct orientation during descent. But as soon as we open the grid fins, we're able to right the vehicle. This is a valuable lesson. The test continues and we try to land the booster, so we know what to do next time out. With fins extended and burst fires, it seems fairly controllable. We continue to hop and experiment in the hope of getting the landing right. That was a valuable test. The initial impacts probably rendered the booster unusable, but the vehicle is clearly capable of propulsive landing. With better piloting, I think we can land the first stage and achieve our goal of a fully reusable rocket. We're hoping for a successful flight today where we can achieve our goal of a fully reusable Tomship 6 and liftoff. The first objective of this flight is to reach orbit, where we will separate the first stage booster from the second stage with capsule. We will then deorbit the first stage and attempt to land it propulsively so it can be reused. The second stage with capsule will then be deorbited for a propulsive landing, so we can recover and reuse that too. If all goes well, this means we'll have achieved our goal of creating a fully reusable orbital launch vehicle. The vehicle is now pitching downrange, and the next event will be main engine cutoff. Ascent through the atmosphere is good, and the vehicle is tolerating the heat. As the main engine throttles down and cuts off, the vehicle enters a short coast phase. Our next event is the orbital insertion burn. And that's objective 1, orbit, achieved. Good stage separation. The second stage will continue in orbit while we attempt to deorbit and recover the first stage. The first stage now begins a backflip to position it in retrograde for its deorbit burn. First stage deorbit burn. The first stage begins its descent through the atmosphere. Temperatures across the vehicle look good. As we saw last time, descent becomes more dynamic and temperatures across the vehicle increase, but it seems to tolerate the heat well. The heat of re-entry subsides and the vehicle is healthy. We're able to deploy the landing legs and fins. The RCS works to pitch the first stage into the correct attitude. We make some descent burns to decrease our vertical speed. As the ground approaches, vehicle orientation continues to improve and we make more deceleration burns. First stage fuel exhausted, and we make our first firm but successful propulsive landing of the first stage. The fins retract and the vehicle is ready to be recovered for reuse in a future flight. We hop back in time to separation and turn the second stage retrograde, ready for deorbit burn. Second stage deorbit burn is good. In a regular flight, the second stage with capsule would stay in orbit long after the first stage has landed and perform experiments or dock with a space station before its eventual deorbiting. As this is a demo flight, we're deorbiting it straight away for propulsive landing and recovery. As the vehicle re-enters, heat starts to build, but all is well. Towards the end of re-entry, the vehicle enters its most dynamic phase. But it tolerates the heat and we're soon through the atmosphere. The legs are deployed and the RCS begins to correct vehicle orientation. Some landing burns begin as we slow our rate of descent. Second stage fuel exhausted. And a firm but successful touchdown, the second stage is ready for recovery and reflight. This concludes our first successful flight of our fully reusable orbital launch vehicle Tomhopper 6. To prove this can be repeated, we flew again. Although the booster ultimately tipped after touchdown due to uneven terrain, it's undamaged and reusable. The second stage with capsule is very controllable thanks to the small engine and sizable fuel tank, perhaps a future lunar lander. And this concludes our journey from a hopper to a 100% reusable orbital launch vehicle in a period of 24 hours. Thanks for watching.